Hey, how's it going? Yeah, good to see you. You've heard it before, pretty much, anyway.
All right, welcome everybody. Special welcome to Duncan and the students from Caledonia. We always like to make it on the curriculum. UNBC offers these noon hour lectures every second Wednesday, and we're always looking for new opportunities to reach out to the community. So thank you very much for coming, including some regulars and some other new faces. This is the last presentation in our winter series. We do have one more here in a second. But, we try and schedule about 6 every semester. So if you or someone you know has an interesting or topical issue that they'd like to air and discuss with the community, we're here to be that forum for you. So my name is Phil Burton. I'm the regional chair for UNBC's Northwest Campus here. And today we are pleased to have a tag team of presenters talking about a very topical issue, sulfur dioxide pollution, which, as you may know, has arisen as an issue because of the recent modernization of the smelter in Kitimat. So they'll be looking at it from two perspectives, one a health perspective and the other a technological perspective. Starting off with, I believe, Dr. David Bowering. Is that right? We're going to start off. And they know of as a MD, a doctor who has been working in the North for many years. Originally from Winnipeg, he grew up in Victoria. He got his medical degree at UBC, and he has been the chief medical health officer for Northern Health for 5 or 6 years before retiring recently. He'll then turn the baton over to Greg Knox, who is a executive director with Skeena Wild, an environmental non-governmental organization. And Greg is also a native of BC and an alumnus of UNBC, and he got his master's at Royal Roads University. And so he'll be ending the discussion with some solutions that could be adopted out there. Gentlemen, I leave the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for being here to share a little bit of time in this airshed that we live in. It's call it the Kitimat Terrace airshed these days. That's what we're talking about. So as you can see, I'm fairly long in the tooth. I go back a long way. And I'm also retired, so I'm into the contemplative phase of life, which means thinking about things with some leisure time to do it. So I'm going to start with the big picture, if you don't mind. So this picture, I believe, was taken in 1969, which was when I graduated from medical school. And at the time, I can remember seeing this pictures like it, and just being absolutely awed by the fragility of this planet, about its position in space, so obviously in the blackness of space, so fragile, delicate, and this sort of and the understanding that it was enshrouded in this gossamer atmosphere that was so vital to life on the planet. And we thought in 1969 that this view was going to change everything. That we would go from, we were in the middle of the Cold War at the time. There was a lot of nuclear arms buildup. We thought we were going to become a much more peaceful planet because we now knew we don't have anywhere to go. Everything is connected. You could, if this thing was in motion, you could see the circulatory system of the Earth moving. If you look at it, you see a pretty healthy-looking southern hemisphere ice cap, Antarctic ice cap. It looks like, at least from what I can say. And in terms of reflecting, I've been thinking for the last 2 days when I made this PowerPoint. What's happened since in 50 years? It's almost 50 years ago, 48 years ago, that we had this clear vision of where we were in space and what our actual living situation was in a visual form. And the other thing that we thought at the time was it's so beautiful, and people wax poetic about it. The astronauts were all absolutely blown away by how beautiful it was. So what's happened since? Have we become more peaceful? Have we protected the environment? Has the environment gotten better? Have we, and clearly, I think if you think about it, the answer to these questions is no. In fact, in so many ways, we've screwed up. Like, it's gotten much, much worse in 50 short years. The globalization, corporatization, the rush that certain people saw when they looked at this to get what they can. Well, this place is finite. We better dig it up quick before it's all gone, I guess, was the idea. So and this is also my declaration of conflict of interest. I'm a Homo sapien from this planet, a not very wise species of being that have spent I spent my working years since that time watching things not go very well. And my background is public health, so I like to think upstream. You know, what's behind all this? And I have a theory, and I'm just going to point out a theory. And before I take the slide away, I invite you to just think, you know, contemplate it a little bit, and think to yourself, you know, what's changed, what's happened in those 50 years? Like, how did we get here? How did we go from such a clear vision of what we were and what we needed to do and how we needed to get along to where we've come? And I say this as background to our very much more local case study of you know, Rio Tinto and the decision-making process around putting more SO2 into the atmosphere than we really need to. And bring it up for yourself at home and think about it. I find it, you know, very worthwhile. So the global economy is my diagnosis. I think we have this view, which is a belief system. It's the dominant belief system of our time that we can grow forever, based on what happened when the European colonizers first came over and saw this new world with all these resources. It seemed infinite. We can continually grow, we can continually expand, we continually get wealthier on the basis of the resources. And things like pollution are actually healthy for the economy. And as a public health person, I have found myself more and more sort of squirming every time I hear people talking about how the health of our economy and how important it is. And, you know, if our economy isn't healthy, we're screwed. And I've often thought as a doctor and as a human being that really it's more important for humans to be healthy, for animals to be healthy, for the and for the planet itself to be healthy. So there's some features of the global economy I just listed, and I'm going to get to the specifics very quickly. I just wanted this as background because at the bottom point there is this global economic view, this belief, it exerts this powerful ongoing negative pressure against the environment. There's always this sort of bottom line, and I used the Trump pun there intentionally. It trumps other paradigms. You know, you can say what you want about the environment, but, you know, we need the jobs, or we think we need the jobs, or certain kinds of jobs, and this economic growth, we have to see growth every year. So there's this powerful ongoing negative pressure against the environment, against human health, and against cultural diversity, and many other things. So what we have seen here around the decision-making in SO2 is a small example, small case study of what's happening everywhere. And really, this is really a very minor thing. But back to our corner of the world, we have very clean air in our region. We're really blessed. This is a view from Thornhill Mountain looking over Lake Else Lake. Some of the cleanest air in the world. I was recently in northern India and Nepal, and the air in that part, and China too, and the air in that part of the world is unbelievably bad. It's so polluted. People wear masks. Half of the people on the streets, maybe more, are wearing masks. People are coughing. Everybody coughs. People are not living as long because of it. The actual health toll is huge. And here we are in this unbelievably blessed, remote corner of the world with some of the cleanest air in the world. And I actually have thought seriously that people in that part of the world could be encouraged to come here for breathing vacations. And I know when I have come back from that part of the world, I just can't get enough of the fresh air at the Vancouver airport, of all places. So we're blessed with some really beautiful air, and this is the airshed area that we're talking about with this specific little case study that Greg and I are going to talk about. And I asked the question, well, here the word world class used all the time. So what does that actually mean? What's really world class? And the picture on the left is a sort of the worst case scenario, you could say. And what's it like to live in that zone, in that sort of really polluted zone where you really breathe at your own risk, versus in the part of the world where we live? What's the most precious and what's the most rare in the world, and what actually has the most value between those two settings? And that economic view I mentioned would say the one on the left, that's the valuable place. That's where stuff is being made. That's where products are being produced. That's where consumers are being fed consumption products. And this place is kind of like a wasteland. Somebody needs to do something here, build something. So our relationship with air is extremely intimate. It's the more you look at the biology of the alveoli, the picture on the left is a picture of the alveoli in the lungs, a soft, spongy organs that we all have. And the more refined the detail that you look at those alveoli, the more you realize that we're in intimate contact with every breath, with every particle, with everything that's in the air. It's designed to move oxygen and gases from the outside into the interior of our bodies, and it's an incredibly delicate and refined mechanism. We breathe 23,000 times a day, so it's not as if we can hold our breath if we don't like the air. We're going to breathe it, and we are breathing it all the time. And we are learning scientifically more and more about just how much interaction there is between what's in the air and what's in our lungs, and what is actually in our bodies as a whole. In air pollution, when the air is polluted, when there are particles of various kinds, it hits us exactly where we live, right in the middle of our bodies, right in the core of our human biology. And these cells on the right-hand picture, they're cells of somebody who may have been a smoker, and the alveoli lining of the lungs. These little cells are black. They're doing their best. They're absorbing the toxins. They're absorbing the particulates, and the blood cells are interacting with these. The gases are being exchanged, and there's a constant exchange of, you could call it information, as a matter of fact, between the information in the air that we breathe and the information that our bodies are trying to correlate. And what happens is that there's also inflammation that goes on. So as these cells are disturbed or are working very hard or are being impacted by toxins and particulate, they're becoming inflamed, and they're stimulating the release of inflammatory proteins and hormones even in the body that have a systemic effect. So it's not just our lungs that are made sick by air pollution. We've learned a lot about this over the last decades, that in fact one of the big outcomes of poor air is cardiovascular disease and other chronic diseases, long-term effects of even low levels of air pollution. So what we know about SO2, the one we're talking about, that this decision-making process, by means of this decision-making process, Rio Tinto was able to almost double the amount of SO2 that it was emitting into the atmosphere above Kitimat to about 42 metric tons every day, which is a big pile of SO2. So it's a respiratory irritant. That's the molecule, pretty simple one, two atoms of oxygen and one of sulfur. It's acutely toxic at high levels. It can kill you if you're in a room with high levels of SO2. But at what people like to call ambient levels, what you're likely to encounter in the world or in a workplace, it creates an inflammatory response in the respiratory tract, an immediate one. So it makes you cough. It gives people with asthma attacks. It makes your exercise capacity, if you're a runner, less. And it increases emergency room visits. And this is a key sentence for me. Like almost all respiratory toxins, there isn't any known threshold below which no effects occur. And we used to think in the world, and it was a convenient piece of mythology, that if you kept pollution levels below a certain point, then everything would be fine, because really, it's the dose that makes the poison. Well, as I mentioned, we're breathing 23,000 times a year. No matter what you breathe, it is interfacing with your circulatory system and with all of the delicate functions of your body. And we have learned that chronic low-level exposure to almost every respiratory toxin has an effect. Difficult to measure, difficult to pin down, but anyway, that's the truth. And there are numerous observational studies about SO2 in particular that suggest its effects are significant over the long term. And I mentioned that it's not surprising, increased mortality from respiratory and cardiovascular disease. And these studies are seen by some as non-conclusive, and really they aren't conclusive. It's not it's not a random, there's no possibility of doing randomized controlled trials, because SO2 never exists in the air independently as if it was the only air pollutant. And it's very difficult statistically to tease out the independence effects of SO2. And the STAR report, which was a forerunner, it was actually a pretty good report that was produced in Kitimat when they were looking at the feasibility of giving a permit to increase this amount of SO2 pollution. Has a really good list of a lot of the studies up to that point. And they're very alarming. I mean, some of them are Canadian studies, but they didn't nail it. And so all that has actually been nailed down is the local short-term respiratory. This, and Rio Tinto admitted in its presentations that it makes people cough and gives them asthma and has these short-term effects. Long-term effects have not been proven, and so they were able to say, well, we don't have to worry about those because, you know, maybe they'll be proven sometime, and maybe we'll put in technology to reduce SO2 at that point. Just a background on the natural history of air pollutants as a cause of disease. This is from an epidemiological perspective. So cigarette smoke is a good one that has happened over, you know, really over my own lifetime too. Starting in the 40s and 50s, people made the observation that smoking cigarettes makes people cough and it makes people's airway irritable and gives them asthma attacks, just like we know now about SO2. But over time, we found out that the damage to the respiratory tract was much more than originally thought, and that it produces these chronic diseases, respiratory diseases, lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And then eventually, as time goes on, more and more studies, mounting evidence over many decades, the systemic inflammatory damage that causes heart disease, not only lung disease, heart disease, and then damage to many organs became apparent. I reiterate that in the early 1950s, it was dismissed as a respiratory irritant only, and you know what the corporate pushback was around admitting that cigarettes actually caused significant disease. It was massive. And you see the same kind of massive pushback against almost every pollutant that a big industrial corporation wants to introduce. And as I mentioned in the second slide, it's the bottom line. It's the issue of we need to not spend money that we don't have to, and we need to get away with what we can because, hey, our bottom line, our economic view is dominant, and we all believe in it to one degree or another. So it's not as if I can point a finger, and I'm not pointing a finger at Rio Tinto in particular, because every corporation would do the same thing if they could. And the question is, why do we let them, or why is the decision-making process the way it is? So just some problems with the decision-making process in relation to installing scrubbers. The decision was based on these outdated models, like that, as if there were a threshold, that if you keep the ambient levels below this, nothing to worry about. Those levels simply aren't accurate and they're not up to date. One of the models, the idea is that because we're only worried about one pollutant, we'll only assess as if it existed by itself in the air. And of course, the SO2 that's being emitted mixes with whatever other pollutants are in the air and with other particles that are in the air. And I mentioned here that they based it all on an air dispersion model. All of this science is based on a model, a computer model that they call CalPUF, which predicts, based on air dispersion and the amount of pollution coming into the atmosphere, where it will go, where it will blow, and whether it'll land on people and get into animals and the environment. But it doesn't factor in climate change. So that's one problem with the model. So the model of climate change, if you model climate change, it suggests, well, we're going to have, more forest fires potentially. There'll be other sources of particulates. We all know that there's a lot of other industry being thought about in this airshed that we're talking about it. So there's going to be other things in the air. But the modeling that lets them get to their decision point is based on this theoretical idea that we only have to worry about one. So we'll try to tease out the independent effect, and it really can't be done. The threshold assumptions, I say, are not valid. And the trends aren't factored in. And I mentioned for every respiratory pollutant that I can think of over my career, we see an initial understanding that there's some problem, makes us cough, or it produces some initial short-term interaction that we can quite easily get our heads around and get a handle on and prove. But these long-term ones are so difficult because we're exposed to so many things over the course of our lifetimes. So we can't really say exactly what the SO2 contribution to sickness and chronic disease is. But there's enough big studies on big populations that suggest it's actually more and more than we think. And you'll see that even the threshold levels are continually going down. They always go down. As we learn more, they get lower and lower. And again, in the STAR report and in the discussion around SO2, there was some recognition that the standards were likely to change. And but the legal position is they only have to meet the standards that are currently in place and have been, put into place by whichever levels of government, federal, provincial, and even in consultation with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, that used to be important, and let's hope something happens to save it, because it was kind of a big standard-setting agency for many years. So these trends aren't factored in. The legal question is, what can we get away with right now when we want to do this? And that's all they have to sort of answer to in the regulatory process. And then the decision-making again. So there are a lot of people who are concerned about the air quality in this valley. See a few of them here. I know them for various reasons. The public consultation, you get 30 days once a permit comes up for consideration. And the way science has gone, again with this economic pressure, is that the regulators actually hand over the science to the potential polluters, to the proponents. And they hire consultants who come and say, okay, here's what we know about SO2. Here's what our high smokestacks are going to do. Here's what our model says where this pollution is going to go. It's all on nice slides. And people come into the room, half the people, more than half the people in the room are wearing badges. They represent, the company that's doing the polluting. And this happens. We see this. You can look at some of the LNG proposals now if you want to go to their public meetings. Half the people in the room are wearing corporate badges, and they greet you, and they sort of give you brochures, and they say, how can I help you? And it's not as if there were independent regulators there to really take a clean, clear look at the process. It's a bit of a sales job from the beginning. So it was a stage-managed, short consultation. Timelines were too short for anybody to look at these pages and pages and stacks of documents that are always sort of part of this process. And I happened to be the chief medical health officer for Northern Health at the time. And we recommended strongly to the Ministry of Environment that they include the installation of scrubbers, which Greg will tell you more about, to reduce SO2 emissions to the lowest achievable level as a condition of the permit they got. But that didn't happen. That recommendation was ignored. And there was a lack of objective scientific review. In fact, as happens more and more, the Ministry of Environment works hand in hand with the corporation wanting to do the pollution. They actually had a consultant working seconded to Rio Tinto while they helped them get this permit to yes. And if you really look at what we call regulation nowadays, it really is a process of the potential polluter hires consultants, and they work with the regulators to get to yes. And actually, a lot of the public consultation simply helps them to improve maybe in some ways the quality of their output. But this is a special case because I don't think anyone really that I know of in this region, or very few, would want to stop this from happening, this modernization from happening, because there are other air quality elements that they actually improved. But in this case, there is technology. It's a world technology that we know about that's reasonably cost-effective to put in place. Kitimat would be the perfect place to do it, but because they didn't have to, they didn't. And so we now have basically a maximum load of SO2 in our air, and I think it will not be without negative consequences. People talk about, the industry likes to talk about, well, we'll monitor the ambient levels at the ground level, but it's also linked to that old threshold model, and it's not relevant to the concerns about these chronic low-level exposures day after day, 23,000 breaths a day, millions of breaths a year that put respiratory and cardiovascular stress on every person who breathes it. And the other piece that I, as an epidemiologist in my background, understand is that we'll never be able to, in this local area with the small population we have, be able to say these health problems were caused by that SO2. We don't have enough numbers. It won't be statistically significant. Too many confounders. We have to rely on our heads, our knowledge, and big studies that have been done elsewhere to say this will be happening. And even as a point of precaution, we should be reducing these outputs as much as we possibly can. Again, that's my take, my bias as a human being, and from my background in public health over the years. So in conclusion, 42 metric tons a day, that's a lot of SO2 being spewed into the air every day. I'm not sure actually if they've reached that level yet, but no. So that's what they're allowed to do, and I guess they're working their way up to it potentially. Some of this stuff is going to be in our airways and lungs every day. The effects will be greater than the models predict because the models are pushed into this as little as possible stance by this, by what I see as this economic view that pushes it that way. And again, I point out our clean air, really, it's truly world class. And if we wanted to fight for anything that was really worth having about being in this area, for me, it wouldn't be about short-term boom and bust type jobs. It would be about, look at here, people of the world could come here and breathe some clean air. What a thing that would be. And for those of us who appreciated it, we think it's worth fighting for. Scrubbers would largely alleviate this concern, and it would be nice if we could continue to work with politicians and all the people we need to push the regulators and the polluters into making it really world class and doing what we can to sort of live up to this image that we like to promote and sell. So that's my little presentation, and once more, I appreciate the clean air. I hope you do, and enjoy it while you can, and see if you can keep it. So I'll turn it over to Greg.
Okay, sorry for the delay, folks. For people who don't know me, my name is Greg Knox, and I work with Skeena Wild and have done so for about 10 years now. And over the past 4 years, we've really been interested in this issue around sulfur dioxide pollution from the new aluminum smelter in Kitimat and the permit that they received back in 2013. So we've done a lot of work looking at both air pollution from RTA, but also from the different LNG developments and stuff like that in both Kitimat and Prince Rupert. And I am going to focus on a lot of the technical solutions that are available to deal with this issue. So a lot of my information comes directly from this report, which was done by Rio Tinto Alcan in 2013. They hired Hatch Consultants to look at all the options for reducing pollution in the new facility. And it's full of great information. It's a well-done report. These guys, Hatch is a world-leading expert in looking at these technologies. And I've also done a lot of work just looking at other aluminum smelters and other types of smelters, coal-fired power plants around the world that have used scrubbers and other technologies to reduce sulfur dioxide pollution. So this is just a very basic diagram of how the smelting process works. And so this is the raw ore called bauxite comes into the facility. I believe they break out the alumina at the facility. I might be corrected there, but
Australia.
In Australia. Okay, so the alumina comes into Kitimat then. Yeah.
It's unfortunate it's a black pile because alumina is pure white.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. So alumina, the raw ore, comes into the facility, and then they use petroleum coke, which is a byproduct of things like oil refining and stuff like that. And they add pitch, and they produce these anodes. and they place the anodes in the alumina in the pot lines in the smelter, and they supercharge it with electricity, with huge amounts of electricity, which essentially causes it to explode and undergo chemical reactions so that the aluminum ore is broken out of the alumina, the aluminum metal is broken out of the alumina ore. And that's simply removing an oxygen molecule from the alumina, and it attaches to the molecules created by the combusting anode, which is carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases. So, the source of the sulfur that forms the sulfur dioxide comes from the coke. That's where the sulfur originates in the process. So this is just a simple diagram of aluminum smelter. So as I mentioned, the coke, which contains the sulfur, comes into the plant. They have to mix it with the pitch and a process called calcining as the initial phase of making these anodes. And during that process, about 18% of the sulfur dioxide pollution in the plant is emitted in that process. And then the pre-finished anodes go into a calcining, into a paste plant, because it's a paste when they produce it. And then it goes into a baking furnace because they have to harden it before they use it in the reduction lines in the smelting process. And so during the baking process, using heat and that, it releases some sulfur dioxide, and it's about 7% of the total produced in the facility. And from there, the finished anodes go into the reduction lines, into the smelter themselves, and as I mentioned, that's when they're mixed with the alumina and supercharged with electricity, and the anodes explode, essentially disintegrate in that process, and some of which turns to sulfur dioxide and is emitted through some's emitted in the pot lines and some's emitted through the smoke. Most of it's emitted through the smokestacks. And that's about 75%, so about 3/4 of the sulfur dioxide is emitted at that stage. So this is important, of course, because we want to know where the sulfur dioxide is being emitted, so we know where we can capture it and what sort of technologies are available to capture it. So in RTA's Hatch report that they did in 2013, they looked at a lot of different technologies, and there's literally hundreds of technologies to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions that are used around the world in various industrial processes. But they have identified in this process several techniques or areas to reduce sulfur dioxide. And I'll get more into the specific processes in the next slide. One thing they can do is use low sulfur coke. The challenge with that is that it's very expensive, and it's also becoming more and more limited. One of the reasons for that is because a lot of this coke is produced in China, and this low sulfur coke, and China is also the world's largest aluminum producer, and they use about they produce about 42% of the aluminum in the world, and that's growing. And they're using it themselves, and they have a lot of air pollution issues they want to use that low sulfur coke themselves. So it's becoming more and more expensive. So that option is somewhat limited, but it is an option. They can use pre-calcined coke or use pre-baked anodes. So that process where we saw about 25% of the sulfur dioxide emissions in the initial phase when they're making the anodes could happen somewhere else, and the sulfur dioxide pollution from that process could happen in another geographic location, removing it from the Kitimat area. So that's an option. Part of the challenge with those options are the expense. They already have the facility set up in Kitimat. There's also people employed doing that process, so it would mean reduced jobs, and it would be more expensive. So that's not an option they considered very highly. You could also, of course, reduce aluminum production, but that would be counter to the whole point of the operation. They want to maximize aluminum production production out of the smelter, because the amount of SO2 is directly related to how much aluminum is produced. Or they could install sulfur dioxide scrubbing technologies, and that's the one that they really focused on as the most viable option for the facility. And I'll talk more about the scrubbing technologies. Or they could, of course, do a combination of these things to reduce sulfur dioxide pollution. So out of those hundreds of options I mentioned, this is a list of the ones that they identified as the most viable at the facility in Kitimat. Wet scrubbing using sodium or soda ash, wet scrubbing using seawater, wet scrubbing using limestone or lime, and dry scrubbing using lime. And in a very basic way, the way that this works is when the pollution from the smelting process goes up a smokestack, they put the scrubbers in essentially where the smoke would go, the emissions would go, and they in a wet scrubbing process they would spray either seawater or water mixed with lime into the air, and it automatically goes, once the sulfur dioxide comes into contact with it, it undergoes a chemical reaction. And the sulfur dioxide is turned into a different form, a different element, so it's no longer sulfur dioxide. Or in a dry scrubbing process, they use either a paste, so semi-dry, or a dry powder type substance like lime or soda ash to mix in with the pollution, and that would undergo a chemical reaction, and the sulfur dioxide would be removed in that process. Of course, there are waste from that process. So in dry scrubbing, you'd have a paste or a powder. Oftentimes, gypsum and other things are produced depending on the type of application, and you'd have to remove that and do something with it. But I'll speak to that in a minute. So what they identified in this facility is wet scrubbing using seawater was the one that they identified in both the report and told us in our consultations with them back in 2013. Their expert said that's the most likely, that's the best available option essentially. So using water from Douglas Channel, spray in with the pollution, or dry scrubbing using lime. So the big question for me and a lot of other people is, okay, well, if they do that, what are the environmental impacts from these processes, and what are the costs and that sort of thing. So with seawater scrubbing, if they would have to take large volumes, about 8,000 cubic meters an hour, out of Douglas Channel and spray it into mix it with the emissions. And in that process, it would undergo a reaction with the sulfur dioxide, and it would turn into sulfate. And sulfate is a common salt. It's essentially sea salt, or a salt that you use on your dinner table. So it's not a harm. It's a benign substance. It doesn't harm the environment or humans. And those would be essentially the only things that would be produced. Is the seawater would contain more of this salt, about 5% more salt. And it's already found in high concentrations in seawater. So a couple other concerns are pH. So they would have to make sure that they would control the pH that wasn't much different than the pH of the seawater that they initially brought in. And then which is totally feasible. And temperature increase is usually 1 to 2 degrees. So they'd have to keep their eye on the temperature, and they could use cooling ponds if needed. But generally, if it's only 1 or 2 degrees, it's not a big deal putting it back into the ocean. So there are no significant environmental impacts from this process. They would be using large volumes of water, but that seawater would simply be returned to Douglas Channel with a very small increase in the salt content in the seawater. And if done properly, there's no environmental impacts. And I looked at a lot of reports from other places, and they've done studies on where this process, seawater scrubbing, has been done in other aluminum smelters around the world, and they haven't found any significant impacts in those facilities. So as I mentioned, the other one they identified as having potential here is in Kitimat is dry scrubbing. So when they mix lime in with the pollution, the sulfur dioxide reacts with the lime, and it turns into gypsum. So gypsum is drywall. This stuff right here, it would produce the same stuff as we put on the walls in our homes and everywhere else. So obviously gypsum has no harmful impacts on the environment, but would require some sort of disposal in a landfill. So they would have to, dispose of it in a landfill somewhere. So that would be an impact, but relatively small. My conclusion was that there's no significant impacts to the land from this, or the environment from this process. Scrubbing costs. So these things aren't cheap. It would cost about $100 million for them to put in a seawater scrubber, which would keep their sulfur dioxide pollution below the levels they were before they did the modernization. So below about 27 tons or so, 25 tons per day. And $200 million if they install scrubbers to reduce the pollution at the facility, sulfur dioxide pollution, by over 90%. And in some facilities, they can capture up to 99% of the sulfur dioxide pollution using this technology. And then there would be annual operating costs in several $1 million. So not cheap, but I guess you have to look at it in the context of the facility. They spent $5 billion building this plant. So 100 or 200 million in relation isn't a big chunk of the project. And they're doing this in other places, which I'll explain. So industrial uses of SO2 scrubbers, they're used in 20 aluminum smelters around the world. So this is a normal technology, widely used. As I mentioned, studies at these facilities, I could not find any significant harm to the environment in my research. They're also used in other types of smelters and coal-fired power plants around the world. And actually, interestingly, China is using this technology in hundreds of coal-fired power plants now in China to reduce sulfur dioxide pollution there. And Rio Tinto Alcan themselves built a scrubber at their Rio Tinto Fair smelter in Quebec a few years ago. This is just east of Montreal. And what inspired them to do so is because Quebec brought in new air quality guidelines in 2011 and forced industry to reduce their emissions of these types of toxins. And so Rio Tinto Alcan spent $85 million in Quebec at the Sorel Tracy metallurgic complex, and they reduced their sulfur dioxide pollution by 60% there. And they employed 170 people in the construction phase, and they employ people in just the day-to-day operation. So it's actually increased employment in the community. So just to finish things off, benefits of scrubbing to the community, of course, are reduced impacts to our health. That's the big one. That's what most people are concerned about. And so that the pollution is not borne by us. Instead, the costs of that pollution are borne by the company, and they take care of it. And that there's little or no acid rain. I know we haven't really touched on these types of impacts, but sulfur dioxide produces acid rain and has all sorts of impacts on waterways, on fish, amphibians, on trees, etc. So that's another concern. And the community would also see more jobs from both the installation and operation of these scrubbers. So that would be a benefit. The benefits to Rio Tinto Alcan would be, it's made significant improvements with the new facility in reducing some of the other pollution, like carbon dioxide and fluoride gas. So this is the kind of the outlier. This is the one place where they're really lacking in leadership, and this would make them truly a world leader in aluminum smelting, and that might be something that's marketable for them, and also good for their corporate image. They could offset the cost of scrubbing by using higher sulfur coke, which costs a lot less. So because the sulfur would be captured in the scrubbing, they wouldn't have to worry about the sulfur content as much in their coke. And then, of course, they would build a healthier relationship with citizens, leaders, and their own union in Kitimat, who has actually taken them to court over this issue. So I think there's a lot of benefits, and I think there's to implementing these solutions, and there's a lot of solutions out there that can be used. So that's all I have. Thanks.
Speakers would be glad to take questions. David, do you want to come to the front again as well? Maybe I'll start off with one for you, Dr. Bowering, if it's not too physiological. What's the connection between irritation in the lungs and heart disease you mentioned?
Yeah, it's interesting. We first really picked that up with particulate pollution, which over the last 15, 20 years has really kind of come into the forefront of people's minds. We thought in the same way that we'd expect to see more deaths due to respiratory causes, but actually most of the deaths from the chronic things are heart deaths. And we think it's the inflammation. Current theory of a lot of chronic disease is that it's based on inflammatory processes. Viruses obviously are part of that, but also, as I mentioned, these small particulates especially that we breathe into our lungs, they're jagged and they're sharp and they damage those little alveoli. And if they're carrying toxins like SO2 or other pollutants, it just sets up an inflammatory response. And it releases this cascade of inflammatory chemicals in the body. And that's what seems to cause these other more systemic outcomes.
So is there a contaminant that makes its way through the bloodstream to the heart, or is just these byproducts?
It's our body's
cells?
response.
Okay.
It's more our response. What we do to try to deal with these toxins at the site where they're most evident, which in this case is in the alveoli. The alveoli are so intimately connected with our blood circulation, as you can imagine, as you know. So yeah, it's not as if the lungs kind of operate separately. They're just these bellows. They're very much connected with the rest. And, so the toxic, it's just a way for the toxins and their impacts to have that effect. I think a lot of health effects really represent the body's response to something as opposed to the thing itself. So.
I just got a question for Greg. I guess from your perspective, is it a regulatory issue then? Like if government, because Alcan or Rio Tinto is only going to do what they have to do. So it's mainly the pressure needs to come from the government?
Yeah,
generally, regulatory?
Generally, if you look at the response of industry to improve pollution, to reduce pollution at their facilities around the world, it's because government or the people who are purchasing their product or consumers are asking them to or making them to do it. Companies want to make money for their shareholders. That's their primary motivation, and so be it. That's fine. And that's why we need strong regulations and regulatory institutions to make sure that they're held up to high standards. So yes, it is. It's a regulatory problem. Definitely. You saw what happened in Quebec. They improved their air quality guidelines, which forced Rio Tinto, Alcan in Quebec to then implement the scrubbers. They didn't just go off and do it because they were, wanted to, But of course, they turned it into a good news story, and it's great. It's a good news story for them and the community, and yeah.
Actually, I've got two, one for each. Can you elaborate on the asthma and SO2? Is it an asthma-like response to it, or are you actually, there's more cases of asthma that you actually now?
Sorry, as SO2 levels, ambient SO2 levels go up, you see more visits to emergency departments with asthmatic episodes, mostly in people who already know that they have a sensitive respiratory airways, they have asthma. Asthma by its nature is episodic. People with asthma are fine until something triggers an asthma attack. And what this irritant does is it triggers asthma attacks in people who already are predisposed. It may actually bring late onset asthma out. There's something called exercise-induced asthma that has been linked to SO2 as well, which increases. And those are the easy things to measure, and they've been well described. And as I say, Rio Tinto in their presentations acknowledged that in their minds, this is the worst case that could happen. But in my mind, actually, even though it's terrible for the people who have it, I think over time, it's these long-term effects that probably are even more important and the ones that are really difficult to measure.
And Greg, so you only sort of pointed out the SO2 of those emissions. I'm assuming there's obviously other ones in there. What does the scrubbing do for chemical reactions to the other pollutants that are in?
Right. So most of the pollutants are they've already removed a lot of the fluoride and reduced their carbon dioxide emissions and that. So in terms of spraying seawater, for example, and mixing that with the pollution that's coming out of the stack, I'm not aware that it actually helps with the other pollutants in that process.
Well, I'm actually even wondering just in the slurry if there is other reaction, what other things end up in there other than, as you say, the salt.
Oh, I see. The other impurities
Yeah.
in, say, if there's a paste or other impurities that go
Yeah.
into the ocean. Well, I think they're at really minute levels, and they're like in the literature when I reviewed this, and in the Rio Tinto oil cans report, they didn't identify that as a concern. They didn't actually talk about it very much. So I'm not aware of I know that there's some impurities, other impurities, but I think they're in such low levels that it's not really a concern. But I could be wrong. So I think Mary Ann was.
Kind of scary to think of 2 refinery proposals also. I wonder, has there been any checking into how it might all combine? I mean, most of our prevailing winds are going from south to north, right toward Terrace.
Yeah, so you're referring to the Pacific Futures
Yeah.
and the Kitimat Clean refineries that are
Yeah.
proposed between here and Kitimat. They're promising to use some world-class technology to really have low emissions. However, there are still some serious concerns about the emissions that will be coming out of those facilities. And I think we're in the process right now of going through the environmental review of the Pacific Futures project to assess what the potential impacts are. So at this point in time, we haven't really done enough of that work for me to say much more than that about it. But in addition to the oil refineries, we have looked at the LNG facilities that we proposed for Kitimat. And if those go ahead, they would produce very large volumes of nitrogen oxides. And nitrogen oxides have similar impacts, both health and environmental impacts, as sulfur dioxide. A lot of the same health impacts that David explained, and they produce nitrogen oxides produce acid rain in the same way as sulfur dioxide. So that pollution would add significant additional. The LNG facilities would add huge volumes of nitrogen oxide pollution and other pollution, including sulfur dioxide, which would, of course, add to the mix in major ways. So that's a real concern. Anything, and even if it's not an industrial process, if you have forest fires, and David mentioned this, is if you have all of a sudden huge, large volumes of particulate matter from forest fires in the air, on top of the sulfur dioxide pollution, on top of other pollution that we produce in our communities through our tailpipes, etc., that can exacerbate the situation, can make things a lot worse.
Just one quick thing, the dry scrubbers, have we thought about a gypsum plant? Instead of burying all that gypsum?
Well, one of the options in some situations, they'll turn the gypsum and produce wallboard or use it in industrial processes. But in this case, it's not economically feasible for them to do so.
What's the comparative regulations for Norway compared to British Columbia? Norway has a lot of aluminum smelters as well.
Yeah.
And I don't think they have any that are not scrubbing SO2.
As far as I could tell, I was really trying to look at this, all of their aluminum smelters have SO2 scrubbers on them in Norway. Their standards are much higher. Yeah, their industry is actually promoting the fact that they have SO2 scrubbers and are doing, and for example, one of the Norwegian companies, Hydro Norsk, I think is the name.
Norsk Hydro.
Or sorry, Norsk Hydro, is also owns a plant in Qatar in the Middle East, and they put scrubbers on that plant as well there. And I'm not sure why exactly they did that, whether they just wanted to because they had done it in these other facilities, or whether the Qatar government was.
Do you know if it's a percentage of SO2 generated that forms the basis of the regulations, or is it
It
just a cap
depends.
of some kind?
It depends on, because of course in different areas there's different things going on. In some areas the sulfur dioxide produced from an aluminum smelter might be the only polluter of sulfur dioxide. In a lot of other areas there's multiple industrial activities. Could be other smelters or other processes going on which add other sulfur dioxide and other pollutants.
Cumulative impact.
So it's really highly variable across geographic regions.
Thank you. I was just recently given a tour of Rio Tinto as a candidate in the upcoming election. And they reported to me that the amount of SO2 they're currently producing is pretty much the same as it was with their old smelter. And so I asked the question then, of course, why did you apply for an increase of 15 tons per day? And it raises a very concerning thing for me. They had mentioned that it was for future increases in production. Brings up the whole idea about the commodification of pollution and people applying for permits, the right to pollute, which could later be used by the same company or traded or sold to other companies. You got any comment about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good point. So RTA hasn't reached 42 tons per day yet. They are ramping up production, so I think they're almost close to full production, or maybe at full production now. So they're not polluting up to that 42 tons per day yet. So a couple things. One is there's, even at 27 or 30 tons per day, they're having impacts on our communities, on our health, on the environment. Two, that in the future they're likely going to have to source higher sulfur coke, and that's going to increase their sulfur dioxide pollution. Three, exactly what you're saying. There's a lot of people that believe they want to trade their ability to pollute, their right to pollute through this permit, to say an LNG company or an oil refinery that comes into the area, and essentially sell that to another company. And that's really concerning. We're giving a company a permit so they can make millions, potentially millions of dollars to allow another company.
In your research, did you see any other countries that put non-transferable, not for resale components in terms of their regulations for companies? So even if you're given a certain quotient, you don't use it, you don't get the right to trade it, or you don't get the right to use it in the future. Have you seen any of that?
I didn't see that anywhere.
Would it make some degree of sense?
Well, absolutely. I would say it would make more sense to put in the regulations in place to minimize the pollution from any industrial facility, especially pollutions like sulfur dioxide, which are so toxic to our health.
Thank you.
So through your presentation, you mentioned outdated air modeling models that were used. Would a different model, if it were to be run with the data that they have, would it have a different outcome? And then what model should they have used?
I mentioned early on, I'm going to sidestep it just slightly to say, I see as behind this what I call a belief system in this economic view, that most important thing is the bottom line. But the nice thing about that is you can change, views can change. People could say, well, instead of making people prove that something will do harm in order to put limitations on the industry. They should have to we could change our minds and say, well, they really need to prove that it's safe. And that would be that would be impossible, actually, for them to do with the models that they use, these idea of thresholds, which I say have no scientific validity. They were just kind of estimates based on population surveys and the best science available at the time. Like I say, the natural history is these thresholds go down and down and down, and the SO2 thresholds everywhere around the world, including Canada, are going down all the time. And they, even at the ambient levels that we have here now, it won't be too long, I'm sure, before the current, the latest thresholds are being exceeded. But because we didn't act, they didn't take the precautionary approach when they could have, and in my view should have. Because my paradigm is not that the economy is most important. I think human health is most important, and that the economy should be serving the human needs, not the humans serving the economic needs. It's something that I'm kind of passionate about, because I just see it so prevalent, this idea that we're supposed to be serving some sort of economic idea instead of it serving us.
In looking at those threshold levels, I've gone into the website for BC Air Quality Monitoring, and maybe they haven't reached their daily maximum emissions, but there are times over the last year or so that they've gone over an hourly or a daily maximum, and the levels of exposure to those directly outside or inside the plant are well above those thresholds. So it makes me think about the workers being at the greatest public health risk for sure, and that the union certainly had right to bring forward the lawsuit. And then also, if you look at the trends, there's a monitoring station just by Kitimat, and we are following the exact same pattern, like the SO2 that we're all exposed to, although at a much lower level, it is directly impacted by, it's the same pattern as down the Hull Road in Kitimat. So it's a little bit frightening to think about.
It's a great comment. It's just a comment that, the workers are kind of one population, but populations that really don't get represented are, small children and infants, and elderly people, and people who already have compromised airways. Most of the workers are pretty healthy. and you could say, well, they're better able to tolerate these pollution stresses. You could say that to a degree. But these vulnerable populations have never really been studied. There's no baseline data on them. And there's very little, even around the world, in terms of clear information about how, what the impacts at given levels are on these more vulnerable populations. We know intuitively, and using our common sense and our brains, that it's going to be more. It's going to be, and especially for an infant who's going to grow up through its developmental phase, breathing this every day, all the time, it's not going to have a good effect.
I think when Rio Tinto designed their plant, the regulatory bodies made them keep a spot in case they will build a scrubber, which I always thought was a kind of an odd scenario. But at least Rio Tinto will never have the excuse, well, we now have designed our plant brand new and we don't have the space, because they had to leave the space.
That's a good point. Yeah, they built the plant at the provincial government. My understanding is they actually made RTA build the plant so that they could put a scrubber in at a later date. That was part of their permitting requirement.
Yeah, every one of the stacks that emits the pelletrum off gases also has a flange built into it to provide future scrubbing facilities for SO2. So they could do it if they wanted to.
Good, time for one more.
Can you maybe speak to how those BC air quality objectives are made? How they come? Too much.
Well,
Okay, sorry.
I mean, there's most, like Western governments, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, for example, they look at the data, they look at these studies from around the world, they get a consensus group. They're by consensus, basically, of experts who say, well, looking at the studies, we can't find population health effects below a certain level, so we'll maybe set the level there or even a little lower to build in what they see as a margin of safety. I tried to point out the problem with that is that it takes the studies and the worldwide observations a long time to start to tease out the effects of individual pollutants. So there's a lag between what we know about how pollutants affect us and where these thresholds end up. And so it's consensus committee. There's no hard science really behind it.
I would add that it's also based mostly on the short-term impacts. So in longer-term impacts like cancer and development of respiratory diseases, premature weight at birth for pregnancies, all those things that are much harder to measure. Like, how do you know if someone goes to the hospital and has a heart attack and goes to the hospital? You can't say that SO2 triggered that heart attack, but we know that sulfur dioxide increases the rates, increases the numbers. And in Canada, a lot of people don't know that the Canadian Medical Association estimates that 21,000 Canadians die prematurely each year of air pollution in this country.
One more?
Just a question. If the Minister of Environment wouldn't listen to, which is responsible for permitting the modernization, and its associated emission levels, wouldn't listen to you as the medical officer of health, wouldn't listen to the regional district of Kitimat or the local hospital board, what can we do to make sure that emissions are properly regulated and permitted?
Well, that's an interesting question from a politician, because it seems to me the answer is political. It's our will. What do we want the regulator? What kind of regulatory system do we want to have? And like I mentioned, right now we've privatized most of the work of the regulators. We allow the companies to do the work, and there's very little pure science left in this world. And there is some, but almost every institution, university, public study that gets done, the proponents, the people signing the checks, have a spin that they want to see put on things. They want a sort of an outcome to go a certain way. So, I mean, we've laid off in our country so many of the regulators and handed it over to private sector. So, I mean, I don't know, but it seems to me we were better off when we had relatively independent from industry people who were actually regulating with the health of the population in mind, not so much how do we help these people get to yes and overcome any objections that might be out there, which is kind of where we are today.
Thank you.
And on that note, would you join me in thanking our speakers today? A token of our appreciation here for each of you, David, before you sit down.
Oh, beautiful.
A little souvenir to take home.
Thank you very much.
There you are, Greg. And again, thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you again, if not May 2nd, then in the fall for another series of public lectures. Thank you.